I'm Dr. Sabrina Siegel with the Neuroscience Education Institute. Welcome to the NEI podcast. On this show, I sit down with renowned mental health care experts from a range of diverse backgrounds to discuss breakthroughs and best practices for treating patients with mental health conditions. In this episode of the NEI podcast, it is my honor and privilege to welcome psychiatrist Dr. Mohammad Alsuwaidan, and he is joining us all the way from Kuwait. Dr. Mo is assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto. He is also the founder of MindWell, a leading regional private mental health center based in Kuwait. He is also a prominent figure on social media in the mental health space, and he leads a podcast called Listen Well by Beatrice. And that podcast focuses on mental and physical health. He was also our host for our 2022 NEI Congress. It's a privilege to welcome Dr. Mo. Welcome to our show today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siegel. The privilege is mine, and it's always such an honor to work with NEI. I loved being with you guys at the Congress, hosting the media there. And I'm glad we were able to set this up despite the 10-hour time difference. So I'm happy to be here.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So my very first question for you is, tell us a little bit more about your background, yourself. How is it that you came to be interested in psychiatry?
Yeah, well, so I guess before medical school, I'm a very multicultural individual. I grew up in the US, as maybe you can tell from my accent, maybe a little bit of Canadian accent in there as well, because I spent a decade in Canada and spent a big portion of my life in Kuwait as well. So when people ask me where is home, it's a very confusing question because I feel at home in 3 different countries. I feel very much at home in the US, in Canada, and in Kuwait. That kind of really informed the way I look at the world, the way I look at people who are marginalized or, at the edges of society. And that really went into how I viewed mental health coming into kind of the end of medical school. I was always interested in the brain. For a while, I wanted to be either a neurosurgeon or a neurologist. But then when I did my psychiatry rotation in med school, it really brought together a lot of the things I was interested in. The scientific part about the brain, but also the social and psychological part, which really I didn't know, but was a thread that connected a lot of the portions of my life in terms of understanding others and having empathy. So it's been a journey since. I did my training at the University of Toronto and then did a master's of public health because that's an area I'm interested in as well in Baltimore at Hopkins. And really, I always say it's been a blessing in my life going into psychiatry, going into mental health. It really gives my life meaning.
That's wonderful. So we know that mental health stigma is common worldwide, but also in the Middle East. Can you share with us what cultural perspectives might influence mental health stigma, particularly in the Middle East?
Yeah, so the Middle East is a very wide area with multiple countries and multiple cultures, but there are very much shared perspectives across the Middle East. The Middle East, just like many Eastern societies, share a lot of traditional views around mental illness and mental health, which are changing over time, but are still prevalent. Mental health in many cultures in the Middle East is still seen by some that it could be some kind of a curse, that it could be the evil eye, that it could be some kind of evil spirit that has affected the person, especially when we talk about illnesses like schizophrenia or bipolar that make a person's behavior change a lot. But even depression sometimes is looked at as an issue of a person's values or, in Western countries, people would say, why don't you suck it up? Right? If there's stigma, right? But in Eastern countries, including the Middle East, sometimes it's, well, maybe you need to be closer to your religion or culture and we know that has really nothing to do with it. Of course, spirituality and being connected to your society is part of holistic mental health, but it's, those things are not the cause. And to tell people that's the cause really minimizes people's experience and takes it out of the medical model more towards, a person feels it's my fault that I caused this in some way. So I noticed that's very prevalent. And then there's also issues around stigma with regards to treatment along the same lines. So doctors are held in high esteem in the Middle East. Psychiatrists are somehow seen different. And part of that is media, right? And that's all over the world. Sometimes psychiatrists, mental health professionals in media still to this day are portrayed as sometimes the antagonists, sometimes evil, sometimes as drug pushers. And that's something that I think is across the world, but I saw very prevalent here. It's, of course, changed a lot over time, but there's a long way to go.
Right, right. I know that you're a strong advocate for reducing the stigma that surrounds mental health, especially in the Middle East. What kinds of actions have leaders in this space taken to address this both in the Middle East and globally?
Well, that's a great question. So it's something I've experienced in several countries, having, again, worked in the US, Canada, and Kuwait. One of the things I saw happen in Canada, and I gave a presentation around some research around this earlier in last year, is big corporations and celebrities coming into mental health stigma and trying to normalize it. So I remember when I was training in Toronto, one of the large corporations, I won't mention the name just in case there's any conflict of interest, but a large non-pharma corporation, a telecom corporation in Canada, did a big campaign around mental health stigma. And part of that campaign was focusing on just talking, getting the conversation going around stigma. And part of that was getting celebrities to talk about their own experience and normalize it for people. There was also, when I was training in Toronto, the university had sponsored something called Mental Health Movie Night. And that would, it was open to the public. A professor at the University of Toronto, usually in psychodynamic therapy or some kind of psychoanalysis, would analyze a movie that had mental health themes and open it up for discussion in the public. When I moved back to Kuwait, I noticed there wasn't a lot of movement happening. So I worked with a number of different colleagues, both psychiatrists, psychologists, and also people just in civil society, to set up a number of different campaigns around this. So we did a lot of media campaigns, radio, TV, social media, which was really kind of booming at that time. It still is. And we tried to get celebrities involved. And one of the big things that happened in Kuwait is one of the members of the ruling family of Kuwait. So Kuwait is a constitutional monarchy and there is a ruling family. We refer to them as ruling rather than royal because it comes from kind of tribal ruling, sheikhdom. She had depression and she was treated for depression. And she said, I want to participate, and came out and talked about it. And that really got the conversation going because people thought, well, if this person who is nobility basically in the Arab world and seems to have everything because she's royalty, can have depression and she can talk about it and can go seek treatment, and that can make a big difference. And I really give her a lot of credit because that opened the doors to a lot of people talking about their own experience. And things have been moving forward since with different, we did a mental health movie night in Kuwait as well. So that helped a lot of people.
That's great.
Yeah.
Wow. That is so inspirational. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. During the pandemic, we witnessed an increase in awareness of mental health conditions, which was incredible. Did this have a positive or negative impact on mental health related stigma in the Middle East? And how did this influence youth and adolescents there?
Yeah, well, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because we saw this all over the world. Maybe that was one of the silver linings in COVID. What is the Chinese proverb? That a challenge is also an opportunity. I think it goes something like that. So what happened with COVID worldwide, and this was reported in multiple countries. We ran a study in Kuwait and compared it to other countries as well. Rates of depression and anxiety across the world increased. Many countries reported it, especially during lockdowns, that the rates tripled of depression and anxiety, the prevalence. And whether that was a point prevalence, that it was some kind of adjustment disorder that people were going through, or whether it was a real increase in major depression or generalized anxiety, remains to be seen. The point is, because people were locked down, school was at home, everything was online, people got to read more and listen more and listen not only to celebrities in terms of fashion and arts and so on, but also to, doctors became celebrities during COVID and started talking about all these challenges. Psychologists became celebrities during COVID. So for me, the silver lining of COVID, which happened here and it happened across the world, is yes, rates of depression and anxiety increased, but that normalized the conversation. And, in our study in Kuwait, and this was reflected in other countries, we found that 3 groups were most affected by mental health conditions during COVID. And it was women, it was young people, so under age 25, and it was students, whatever age they were. And there's a lot of theories. What were the unique challenges that these 3 groups faced? But yes, we saw that spike, but then we also saw this group of individuals seeking help for the first time, speaking out openly. We started a program in Kuwait called Corona Care, which was a free mental health counseling program. We provided 6 sessions of mental health counseling free for 3 groups. And it was the groups that we kind of had researched. So it was first line responders, doctors, and then quarantine workers and so on. It was students. And then it was also people who were, for us, there was a lot of Kuwaitis stuck abroad for a while that couldn't come back in. So we were giving them mental health counseling because they didn't have insurance in the countries where they were either vacationing or studying, and there were no flights, so they couldn't come back for a while. So we were seeing them online.
Wow.
And we got
that just gave me
number of
goosebumps.
volunteers. Yeah.
That's amazing.
So there's been stories like this all over the world. So I think that was the silver lining of COVID in a way. And that conversation has moved forward since then.
So let's shift gears a little bit here. I know that you are also an expert in a therapeutic modality used to treat depression called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. What is TMS?
Well, TMS is really fascinating. And I know, Dr. Siegel, it's an area you're very passionate about because we've had conversations around this. So TMS is a form of brain stimulation. As you said, it stands for transcranial, so across the cranium or across the skull. Magnetic, so it uses magnetic waves, not electrical waves. Stimulation, so it stimulates neurons. So if we think of the brain as a big computer, which it is in a way, but it's a very advanced computer, and it's a computer that has much more complex signaling than a PC. One of the things or the theories that we have around mental illness is not just chemical changes, but also kind of, if you will, network connectivity within the brain. That in certain mental illnesses like depression or OCD or others, there's a disconnect between very specific, important nodes in the brain that have to do with these disorders. And that's been studied for years. And TMS has been studied for well over 20 years. It basically uses very strong magnetic impulses to induce a current between neurons without using electricity. And this reduces side effects compared to an electrical stimulation approach like electroconvulsive therapy. And more studies show that as the protocols have been improving with TMS, that it's extremely effective in treating a wide variety of mental health conditions. Most notably that have been approved by the FDA are major depression and obsessive compulsive disorder. Though off-label, it's been used for a lot of other different mental health conditions. It is a very safe therapy. There's a very small risk of having a seizure during therapy, but that's been estimated somewhere around 1 in 30,000 sessions or less. And it has less systemic side effects than medications. And again, this is coming from someone who prescribes medications for people who need it. But we do know that some medications come with side effects. TMS seems to have, on average, most patients complain of less side effects because it's not going into the whole system. It's affecting a specific area. And with new protocols, it's actually very fast acting. So if you speed up TMS, you can get the responses in depression or OCD very quickly.
So what made you want to bring this type of treatment to Kuwait? And can you share what that process was like, the process of creating your own TMS center in Kuwait and some of the challenges that you faced?
Well, you see, that comes from having worked and lived in different cultures. I was very lucky in Toronto that some of the leaders of TMS were working there at the time. The ones I closely collaborated with were Dr. Jeff Daskalakis and Dr. Jonathan Downer. So two very big names in TMS research. And at the time, they were doing a study when I was a resident going into fellowship. They were doing a study called the 3D study, which was later on published. And at that time, stimulation with TMS took 37 minutes of stimulation or 19 minutes, depending on the protocol used. In their study, they proved that you could use a 3-minute stimulation and get a very similar effect with not much more side effects. So that was happening as I was moving back to Kuwait. And I was seeing that study in real time, even before it was published, and seeing the dramatic results of some of the patients that I had referred into that study. So I became interested in TMS since that time. I did some training in it at that time. Came back to Kuwait. There were no TMS machines in Kuwait. So for a while, all I knew about TMS was just updating myself with research and chatting with John and Jeff and getting updates about what was happening. Eventually, we were able to import the machine into Kuwait. One of the biggest challenges was there was no vendor. So I actually had to apply. I had to go to the Ministry of Commerce and apply for an importation license, which is something doctors don't usually do. So that took a while. I got an importation license and then talked to the vendor who was in Germany, the company that we used, and got the machine into Kuwait. So we had the very first machine in the private sector in Kuwait. And since we kind of opened the doors, there's been more TMS machines. And the results we've been seeing with patients are just fantastic. Of course, not every single person responds, but we're getting response rates well into the 80% of patients who try it, including patients who've tried numerous medications and weren't seeing a result. So it's been really heartwarming and fulfilling when you see someone who's tried 5 or 6 different medications and then they do TMS and they get a response, and they're so thankful that you brought this modality to them where they would have had to travel to get it done. Yeah.
Yeah. That's amazing. So what stigma surrounds TMS in the Middle East, and more broadly, how have you been able to address this?
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest thing is people are fearful of a machine on their brain, because one of the things they think about is, old movies, whether Hollywood or Bollywood or any culture, that show dramatic and very negative portrayals of brain stimulation, namely electroconvulsive therapy. And so, yes, for sure, electroconvulsive therapy had a dark age in which we didn't have a lot of the modern technologies we use with ECT, such as muscle relaxation and, better anesthesia techniques and better ECT machines. And so people have that image of someone getting a seizure while being on their brain attached to a medical device. And then even people who are not aware of ECT, even though, by the way, ECT, I'm sure as many listeners know, has made a lot of progress, still used in mental health. Yes, it has usually a little more side effects than TMS, but nowhere near what's shown in old movies. I think the other challenge is, even if a patient isn't aware of ECT, the idea of having kind of energy going into my brain, and what does that do? And like, what's going to happen to my brain cells? And are they going to get fried? Is there going to be long-term damage? So those are some of the questions people ask. And, thankfully we have the internet now. And so people can go online and see testimonials and actually see what a session looks like on YouTube before they try a session. And that reduces stigma around TMS a lot, or brain stimulation in general.
So you touched on this a little bit earlier, but what sorts of outreach activities do you do in Kuwait and abroad to help reduce the stigma of mental health? And what advice do you have for clinicians who want to get more involved?
Yeah, so there's lots of ways to reach out. So one of the things we did in Kuwait, or one of the things I advise everyone to do, is don't work just with doctors and psychologists and clinicians. Get out into civil society, talk to non-governmental organizations, volunteer organizations, advocates, try to get in touch with celebrities who are passionate around mental health, because they can be a really strong voice for the cause, and patients who are willing to speak out. It's always difficult. I always try not to, because there's always a power differential. So I try not to tell my patients, look, why don't you speak out? But if they tell me I want to speak out, then direct them to the right way to do it. And then think about activities that can happen in society on a day-to-day basis. One of the things we did here was do a marathon. So we actually called it a walkathon because we wanted to include all levels of fitness, where it was a 5K. So we used the metric system here. So it's a 5 kilometer walkathon. And there were stops at every kilometer with a station where someone talked about one aspect of mental health. So it wasn't a race. People would just stop, and it was very social. We try to get involved in a lot of community events. So whenever there's let's say an outdoor open market, then we'll approach the organizers of that market and say, hey, would you give us a free booth? We're not selling anything. We're just going to have a station where we show videos where we talk about mental health. It's not promoting any clinic. It's not promoting any service. It's all for mental health. So we try to get out there. If you ask nicely, people will, especially if they notice you're not commercial, they'll actually help you. And then one thing that's really important is getting out on the platforms that young people are using today. All people, but mainly young people are using today, because mental health differentially affects young people. So social media is definitely one area that I encourage clinicians to get involved, because that's where your audience, for lack of a better word, who need to get that information and get the correct information, are going anyways. So if you're not there, they might get the wrong information.
Oh, yeah. 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 So with that, talking about platforms, especially for younger people, you are very prominent in the mental health space on social media. How did this start, and how were you able to build such a strong following?
Yeah, that's a really interesting story. So just for background for listeners, and I think what Sabrina is mainly referring to is Instagram, where yes, indeed, it's getting close to almost 100,000 followers, a verified Instagram account. I actually didn't start off with Instagram. Instagram, didn't exist at that time. Like many people started off with Twitter. And this was back when I was a resident in Toronto, and I would tweet information about mental health, an interesting study, something to reduce stigma, mainly in English. I am multicultural. I speak English and Arabic, but I learned English first, and English remains my stronger language in terms of reading and writing. I would say now, because of the story I'm about to tell, Arabic has become equal. And I think my parents are very happy now because my Arabic was always weaker. And it's a very useful language because I think it's, what is it, like the fourth most or fifth most widely spoken language in the world because it spans so many countries. And classical Arabic, I mean, there's different dialects of Arabic, whether you're in Egypt or Morocco or Kuwait, but the written and read Arabic are the same. It's like, spoken German and then High German, same idea. So what happened is I started tweeting that information and started building a following. Then Instagram came out and I joined early. I'm an early adopter when it comes to tech. And I noticed when I would post a video in English, it would get, 100 views and people would interact. And then I would post a video around mental health in Arabic and it would get 10,000 views. And it blew my mind because then I realized, the difference was that in English, there was so much content out there, but then in Arabic, there wasn't. And I thought to myself, well, do I keep going in both languages or do I serve the populace that maybe me and only a few other people can serve because we're mental health clinicians, we're trained in very strong universities in Canada and the US, and we can bring that information in the language that people speak and understand. So then I kind of focused full force on Arabic. And because it's so many countries that speak it, even when I was still in Canada, I built a huge following in Arabic countries across the Arabian Gulf and other Arab countries. And it just kept going. It was even a surprise when one day I woke up and I got a message from Instagram that your account has been verified. People ask me all the time, how did you get your account verified? And I say, I actually don't know. Instagram just verified it. So yeah, it's really interesting. But the point isn't to build a huge following. The point isn't to get verified. Even if you have only, a few hundred followers or 1,000 followers, or even if you develop 1 million followers, I think the content information of what you put out is important because as we alluded earlier, sometimes there's incorrect content out there. And some clinicians who are listening might have seen it in their patients where they come with misinformation around mental health or having self-diagnosed in a wrong way. And so I really think it's our duty as clinicians. It's not even something that we should do in our spare time. I really think it's become a must that we need to educate publicly. And each of us has a role to play, whether big or small, but we need to get out there and really send the correct message around mental health.
Right. I think especially, you touched on some misinformation on social media. And I think that's so true especially on some of these other platforms like TikTok and those kinds of things that adolescents are using, and it's kind of like they're diagnosing themselves. They're sharing information amongst themselves, not from licensed professionals, not from people with the background, with the education, with, the knowledge that's accurate.
We're seeing it a lot with TikTok around tics and around ADHD. That's been a huge thing recently. I don't know if that's been happening also in North America, but it's something I'm seeing here.
Yeah, well, there seems to be these sort of global issues. I've noticed in mental health that someone will get wind of something that's not accurate and then it kind of spreads globally. And more so on TikTok, it seems, but I think also on Instagram. And that's why I agree. I think it is so important for people like you with, the background and the experience and the credentials and all of that to say, go ahead and educate what's correct about mental health, because it's not just, we're not talking about something that's, just frivolous. This is very important and it can be damaging or dangerous when people have the wrong information when it comes to mental health.
And one thing I can give advice around is it's really important to have a positive message always. So one of the things I try to do is even when I'm dispelling a myth, spin it in the positive way. So I won't say something like, you may have heard this and that around ADHD. Well, that's wrong. Here's the right thing, because that puts us on an ivory tower. And, so instead, I don't address the misinformation. I just say, have you heard about ADHD? Well, ADHD is this and that, and this is how you treat it. So having that positive message. And then I try to use very normal language. I try to avoid medical jargon as much as possible. Because once you start throwing around really complex words, people stop listening.
Right. And I was actually just going to say that you're very approachable. You're, very down to earth. And so I think that probably also lends way to having these more followers because people will connect with you on a personal level. And I think sometimes that's challenging, especially for a younger population, to be able to listen to what it is you're trying to share with them, So I think that's really good advice for clinicians as well. And that takes me to my next question, which is what sort of content do you tend to share on Instagram for clinicians in mental health? And then what about directly for patients?
That's a great question. So with clinicians, I really haven't focused the Instagram and Twitter portion of the work I do on clinicians because there's so many other resources. So for clinicians, and it's just so time consuming, you just can't do it all. So for clinicians, really the podcast I worked on, which is Listen Well, which is not necessarily mental health. I mean, we do talk about a lot of mental health topics, but it's health in general. So for example, we had an episode on menopause or an episode around, some diseases or issues where people might find a lot of stigma around like sexual health, right? So that, and then talking to advocates and doctors. So that's been useful for clinicians and patients. On Instagram, I tend to use very normal language, no medical jargon. I do try to push the boundary and I try to keep my viewers and listeners informed. So I will talk about a new study. I'll say, well, this study just came out around TMS just last month, but I won't use I won't say, well, the researchers use this methodology and here's my breakdown and analysis of the methods. And here's the p-value and so on. People won't get that. So I'll just say, well, the overall finding of this study, in my view, is this. And here's how we should interpret it in terms of how we treat patients. The other things I do is just talk about diseases. And one of the things I noticed is that we assume a lot of things about the general public. For example, we assume that most people really understand depression as an illness. It's not true. A lot of people don't. We assume people understand anxiety as an illness. And really there's a blurry line between what is illness anxiety and what is, a normal fear that you have before an exam. What is depression as a disease? And then what's sadness and normal emotion? And that's one of the areas I focus on a lot. How do you know that you have a disorder where you need to seek help? What are the signs and symptoms you should look out for? And that's basically another way of saying, if you need help, seek it, but you're not saying it directly.
Right.
You're teaching someone, as opposed to, giving the person a fish, you're teaching them how to fish.
And that's so important what you said just there, because I think a lot of what's happening with the youth is that they're trying to kind of help each other navigate mental health because they don't know the answer to things like that. Like, when is it something that they would need to reach out and get professional help, and I think that's such a great topic for you to address.
If I was to guess what is the most common question I get as a direct message or as a comment on Instagram, that is the question. How do I know I need to seek help? And every time I answer that question, I say that whenever I've answered it, even in Arabic, I'll say, this is the commonest question I get. And my answer is that if you started to think whether or not you should seek help, then that's the time to seek help, right? Because once you have that thought, then it's not wrong to actually get an assessment. And the way I put it is, what's the worst that can happen? The worst thing that can happen is not bad, because the worst thing that can happen is you sit with the clinician and they tell you, look, I really think you need some lifestyle changes, but I don't think you have a mental disorder. Case closed. If you ever need anything, come back and see me, but I think you need to exercise and, work on your sleep habits, maybe cut down on harmful substances and have a spiritual practice and connect more with your positive social life. Well, that's not a bad outcome. The best outcome is that you could actually have a name for what it is you're suffering from and figure out a way to deal with it, whether it's a biological or non-biological treatment. And that's a great outcome, because then that's the first step towards recovery, actually figuring out what you have.
Right. Absolutely. Where can we find you on social media?
Well, that's actually easy. So on Instagram, it's just my name. So everyone calls me Mo. That's the name I've gone by for a long time. So it's Mo Alsuwaidan, Alsuwaidan. It's a long last name, like many Arab last names. And then on Twitter, it's the same. And then my website is also the same thing, moalsuwaidan.com. But Instagram is where I'm most active. Since hosting NEI's media content, it's given me pause, because I've had all my content in Arabic for a very long time and focused on that. What I've been trying to do recently, because I've had more followers in North America, is even if I post an Arabic video, I'll put English subtitles, which is a lot of work, but I think it's worth it. Because,
I have noticed that. It's wonderful. It's really helpful.
It's really helped my instant translation skills. So I guess, if I ever give up psychiatry, I could do closed captions for
there you go. Any last words of advice that you have for clinicians when it comes to treating mental health and helping to eliminate the stigma?
Yeah. So two things. One is that always try to keep in mind, because we have very busy days and it's easy to get burnt out, but always keep in mind what brought us into this profession in the first place. I'm sure all of us have different reasons. I talked about my reasons for going into this profession, but again, I have friends all over the world, in Europe and in Canada and the US. They're really my family, and that's my sense of home. And when I've talked to friends within the mental health community, whether they were interested in the brain or they had a mental health issue in their family or whatever reason brought them to mental health, the thread is that there's a deep passion around helping people who are on the margins of society. And by definition, people who have mental health conditions, whether rich or poor, whether high or low social status, are on the margins of society because of stigma. And that happens worldwide, not just in Eastern countries, in Western countries as well. And so I always try to remind myself of that these are the people I've chosen to align with and to help. And even if I get frustrated, even if a patient's being angry, I just remind myself why it's so important to work with this group, because they've had a really tough time in life. And if I can make their life just that much better, as I said in the beginning, that gives a lot of meaning to me and hopefully to the society I serve. So that's one. And then the other thing is we can no longer afford to focus our efforts on one patient at a time and with one modality of treatment, which is psychotherapy or medication or both. We really have to zoom out and think about treating patients thousands or millions at a time. And how do you do that? Through education. Stigma, the key to stigma is fear, right? Human nature, you fear what you don't know. And so the best antidote to stigma and fear is knowledge. And so if we can impart that knowledge, then we reduce that fear, we reduce that stigma, and we've done a huge service. And so we need to get our knowledge out there, not only in conferences, but where the populace is. And the populace is on some of this new media. So we shouldn't shun it. We really need to embrace it, because that's how we can reach people and impart that knowledge that would reduce stigma and decrease fear.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mo, for all of this incredible information and just for sharing your journey with us and your story with us. And thank you for being on our show. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and tune in next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the NEI podcast. Please let us know what you'd like to hear more about by leaving a review. Don't miss another episode. Subscribe today.